Welcome back, everyone. Dr. Boghossian here. Today, we're going to continue our discussion about the morality of capital punishment. If you haven't watched presentation number 1 on the pro side of the discussion that focuses on the paper by Igor Primorac, go back and view that. I think that'll be very helpful to you to watch them in sequence. And there's some important background information there that you'll need to get down before you continue into the second presentation on Stephen Natheson's arguments against the morality of the practice. Also, make sure you go over to the Canvas module and with this, where this material is present, and get the handout if you haven't already. You need to take good notes as you listen and follow along. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and we're going to jump right back in to this discussion and look at Stephen Natheson's reasons for thinking capital punishment is immoral. Okay, everyone. Stephen Natheson has multiple reasons for thinking that capital punishment is not morally justified. It's never morally justified. And so he's going to run straight the opposite direction, or straight at maybe Igor Primorac's views. And I'll be interested to hear what some of you think about this. I'm going to point to some other language and kind of variations of this kind of view as we go, because here, at least locally and nationally, there are groups of people who are very sympathetic to this kind of view. You find both secular and religious types who believe that we should not only have the death penalty abolished in our own state, but that should be a federal law, that we should outlaw the practice. And so there's still some ongoing debate at the federal level and in other states about this. But even this year so far, we've seen multiple people who have received the death penalty as a form of punishment. And so I think this is a very important topic for us to continue thinking about, whether it's moral or not. Stephen Natheson, he has 4 or 5 arguments for thinking it's not ever justified. He looks at the lex talionis principle, as we called it last time. This is often used by the pro side of the discussion, or certain kinds of proponents coming from a retributive model, an Aristotelian model, or a Kantian model that believes that, we should treat actions as devaluing or safeguarding the values in play, right? What is good and of having value. In the case of capital murder, what we have is the value of human life in play. And human lives have intrinsic value. They are of immeasurable worth, irreplaceable value. And so Kant, along with Aristotle, holds that the only way to kind of balance the scales of justice in society when a murder takes place is to operate on the basis of an eye for an eye, or lex talionis principle, where we return in kind, right, what has been done to them. And if someone commits capital murder, we are justified to take their life, which is a non-innocent life, to balance out the scales of justice. Now, Natheson has a couple of arguments against this principle. He thinks that if we're consistent in our moral thinking, in our use of this principle, we would have to actually do wrong, clearly immoral things to criminals of other kinds. Number 1, take forced sexual acts, right, like rape. There's a good reason why we don't do that to people who commit that sort of atrocity. Well, why? Well, probably because it commits a violation of the 8th Amendment. It's cruel and unusual punishment. It goes way beyond the pale, so to speak. By analogy, Natheson says, look, murder's the same way. Once we've incarcerated that person, the state has the upper hand, and we shouldn't do to them something clearly immoral that they have done to someone else, just like in the case of rape. Or, dismembering, right? This is why we don't cut off the hands of thieves and so on. And so we don't do those things because it's a misapplication of this principle. It's very crass, right, and deeply wrong. He thinks it's the same in the case of capital punishment. Number 2, he thinks that the eye for an eye principle is actually an unhelpful principle and it's very limited at best because it doesn't help us know how to punish a whole bunch of other kinds of crimes, right? How would we punish the crime of prostitution or drug dealers, human traffickers? We're going to traffic human traffickers, make a drug dealer, snort a bunch of their own product? Well, clearly not. Again, because that violates the Eighth Amendment. It is forcing us, it's encouraging us to engage in activities that are clearly morally wrong. And so he thinks we need to dispense with this as an action guiding principle in general. He thinks the eye for an eye principle is just not helpful and in general, and therefore we shouldn't cherry pick it to use it in the case of capital punishment either. Now, Nathanson anticipates what some of you on the other side of the discussion from him might say back to him. And someone might say, well, look, you're reading this principle too literally. It's really a generic, general framework kind of principle that says we are justified to inflict the same level of punishment, intensity of punishment and suffering on the criminal that they've dealt out to others. So, we might put someone in jail for a really long time for committing domestic violence or sexual assault or something like this. But that's sufficient, right, to inflict equal pain and suffering. That's why we don't act the same towards them as they did towards their victim. And so it's different in the case of capital murder, right? We don't inflict, we can't inflict even an adequate level of suffering on them by putting them in prison for life without the chance of parole. That's why the capital punishment is needed. Well, Nathanson, let me go back. Nathanson says, okay, but that's a good, interesting pushback, but it doesn't go through because lex talionis, if it's going to be used at all within the moral domain, has to be more usable, right? It has to be practically useful across at least a bunch of cases, and it's not, right? And since it's not, it doesn't help us figure out how to proportionately punish people, then we shouldn't just use it in the case of capital murder, right? It's to cherry pick it. It's to only use it in a case because maybe we're vengeful and angry. But then it's on us to deal with our vengeance and anger and find more adequate, reasonable means to punish the criminal. Let's look at his third argument. Number 3. He says that society should communicate and reaffirm a respect for the value of human life, the immeasurable worth of human life, even in how we punish, especially in how we punish terrible things that people do to each other. And he grants people do terrible things, including take innocent life. You might write off to the side, he doesn't call his view this. This is sometimes called a communicable view of justice, or a communicative theory of justice. A communicative theory of justice is saying that the goal of punishment is to say something, right? It's to say a message, send a message both to the criminal, to the victim's family, or the victim and their family, as well as to society, that we're not going to stand for this. We're not going to tolerate this sort of action. It will be punished and you will be held accountable. But what we shouldn't say, right, is that your life becomes without value because you've done something terrible. And Primoratz thinks if we use the death penalty as a form of punishment, we actually send the wrong message. We might partly be sending the message that we're not going to tolerate it and allow for it. But we go over the line from there to actually devalue a human life that's done something terrible and say that now it's totally without human worth. That's page 404. I would like you to pause the video here and think about this and critically engage it. What do you think about that? This is a really interesting and thought-provoking statement he's making. He thinks that we could actually respond through our punishment of individuals in a way that says something wrong, right? Actually communicates the wrong thing. So I want you to think about a few things here. Is he correct in the case of capital punishment? Are we communicating that life is without worth if we take the life of the perpetrator? Number one. Number two, to help you think about that, you might think about other frameworks for punishment. Think about punishment in the academic context or a family context. Are there forms of punishment where a parent or an administrator could communicate to someone who's done something really wrong, communicate the wrong thing, communicate that they're without worth, or actually devalue them unintentionally? Yes or no, why or why not? What does that have to do with capital punishment? And then come back and we're going to continue looking at the rest of his arguments. Okay, welcome back. I want to add another term here that I'm going to mention a few times. I'm suggesting that Stephen Natheson's view is a kind of communicative theory of justice instead of retributive. But I also think he has elements of what might be called restorative justice working here, as we'll see in the next two arguments he makes. Restorative justice is pretty well known. It's becoming increasingly common. In our own area, here in the Central Valley, we have a number of Mennonites who are pacifists, right? And they adhere to a restorative theory of justice. Now, you could adhere to a restorative theory of justice and be a secular person, right, and not affiliate with the Mennonite tradition. Or you could be religious in another way, right? You could be, there are Catholics who are hold to restorative justice, Eastern Orthodox people who hold to that, Buddhists, Hindus, okay, and so on. And so this is a broad kind of view that says that the goal of punishment has to understand that the goal of punishment is to restore multiple relationships and multiple people, right, that are affected by a crime. Restore the perpetrator to society, restore them to right relationship with themselves, even in a certain way, right, to become reformed, to restore them to their own family, if they have one, to restore them to the victim's family, restore them to the victim if the victim's still alive, and so on, right? So it's to restore. This has all the makings of rehabilitation, reform, all because it's trying to take a very holistic human view of punishment as opposed to a very abstract one like this view tends to think of the retributive model, where it's just abstract, metaphorical scales of justice. And it would be a misunderstanding that they're not deeply concerned about the severity of crimes and even harsh punishment. They believe, Stephen Natheson's even believes, right, we can send a really strong message with severe punishment, but we have to use severe punishment within the framework of aiming to help the wrongdoer become a better human and help them in their, as much as possible, contribute to the world again, instead of writing them off as like throwaway goods because they've done something really horrible, okay? And so what you get here is that view, I think, kind of showing up, even though, again, he doesn't use that language. It shows up here in argument 4, where he says murderers forfeit some of their rights, but not all of their rights. There are certain things we just shouldn't do to them or other criminals, right? And this is where he distinguishes between what persons deserve versus what humans deserve, right? He thinks no human deserves to be tortured, right? No one deserves to be treated in these ways, raped, murdered. And to treat people very, right, as an individual, right, we need to take their humanness into account. And what we do here then, if we do that, is that human dignity, all human persons, including murderers, right, have inherent human worth. They lose some of their rights and forfeit some of their rights that connect to that worth, but they don't lose all of their rights. Their right to life, he believes, cannot be lost. They can lose other rights like possessing a firearm, continuing their job, living in their house, going out to In-N-Out Burger, and so on. But abolishing the death penalty, he believes, will actually reaffirm the value of human life, that we actually see the murderer as a human being with value who's done something really wrong to devalue another person and even their family members and society, but that we want to help redeem that person who's committed those atrocities as much as possible by encouraging them to repent and reconcile with all the relevant parties. And that to bring, this is the restorative model now, to bring the parties who were victimized to where they could potentially forgive. Let me give you a quick story. In the Central Valley here, a number of years ago, affiliated with, there used to be a Center for Peacemaking affiliated with Fresno Pacific University. There are still remnants of this kind of thinking and this model in town and in the local justice systems, from what I understand. But it was deeply connected to them at the time. And we knew some people who were connected to that center. And there was a case that made the news where some high school boys had too much to drink after a Friday night football game, and they were driving under the influence, and they did some really horrible things. And the felony that they committed was so severe that they were going to be tried as an adult. They could be tried as adults. Now, what happened was when they went before the judge actually gave them an option. The judge said, we can do this one of two ways. We can do this, and these are my words, but this is essentially the options given in light of our discussions this week. We could do this the retributive way, or we could do this the restorative way. The restorative way is you're going to, instead of being tried as an adult, you'll be tried as a juvenile. And that's good for you, right? Because if you do all these things on this restorative model, our goal is going to be to restore you, reform you. And then you do your time, and then in juvenile hall and in the community and so on. And then your record will be expunged and will get back out there and you contribute to society. But what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go to therapy, right? And you're going to have to go to the family's property that you did these horrible things to, and you're going to do your community service on their property, fix things for them, etc. And you're going to do that with supervision, and you're going to report back, and they're going to report back too. On top of that, we're going to bring you together with some mediators to meet with the family, where you can hear from the victims' families what you've done and how this has shattered their lives and affected them. And you're going to listen, and you're going to learn to hear what they've done, what you've done, how it's affected them, so that you can repent and ask for forgiveness. And you're going to do your time in juvenile hall. And if you will do all this, if we, as a court, right, and as social workers and so on, are convinced that you have changed, repented and changed, and become reconciled with this family, then we'll, expunge your record and so on. That's option, the restorative option. If you say, no, you don't want that you don't want to go work on their property, and you want to say, essentially, F it, I want to, do what I want to do. I'm not going to submit to that program. Well then, or if at any point we feel like that's what you're going to do, like maybe you want to start an option A, but you quit because it's too hard. You don't want to admit your wrongdoing to the family or something. Well, then we're going to bump you over to option B. Option B is the retributive model. You'll be tried as an adult. You'll go away for a very long time. And you can kiss the bulk of your adult life goodbye. No college, okay? It's going to be very difficult for you. Well, I'm happy to report in this particular case, they chose option A, they stuck it out. And it was a series of months, right? Even a year or so, where they went through these steps. They met with their therapist, they met with the family. Eventually there was reconciliation. The family forgave them. They listened to the family. They became friends even. And they changed, they became positive contributing members to society. Primratz would say, yes, that's what we should be doing. We should be doing more of that. Even in the case of an adult who commits a capital murder, we need to surround them with human love and affection in appropriate ways to try to invite them to change. become a better person. Now, maybe that means a better person from behind bars for the rest of their life, but maybe they get an education, right? And they study and they learn and they can somehow contribute to society from behind bars, like Stanley Tookie Williams. And he thinks that would be the most dignifying thing we could do as a society. And that would really help us build into our DNA, our social fabric, that we value human life kind of across the board, instead of capital punishment, which seems to be at odds with that. Number 5, he says, look, the state should model self-control for its citizens. What happens when a capital murder is committed is a person is out of control, right? They're not exercising self-control, which is a virtue. Instead, they're out of control, and the worst sort of things goes down. But once the state apprehends them, tries them, and convicts them, they have the upper hand, and they now have an opportunity to break the cycle of violence and to send a clear message that we will not tolerate capital murder, we will value human life and dignify it, and we will break the cycle of violence. That's what we want. And he thinks that not practicing the death penalty is the only way to do that. Instead, if we practice it, it only reinvents the cycle of violence upon violence. In fact, there are real life cases where a younger family member gets embittered because their older brother or sibling was put to death for murder, and then they want to get back at the system. Okay. And so he thinks we can kind of overcome this evil by doing something good, by not returning in kind. So I want you to pause the video. What do you make of Natheson's case against the death penalty? Is he right about the symbolic message that the state sends and the effect that the message sends? Is the message the wrong message in the case of the death penalty and the right message in the case of kind of restoring the restorative model? And maybe to help you think through this, go Google restorative justice and look at some of the materials on restorative justice. And then if you have any questions on any of this, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to arrange a Zoom meeting with you to where we can interact kind of face-to-face about it. I love talking about these kinds of topics or any topics, and try to really get clear on what justice requires in this kind of case. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week when we pick up our next social ethics topic. Take care.